hope you got something out of week one. Week one, we talked about a heart of generosity. And if you weren't here, as always, you can go to our website and see the videos. But the idea was all based on one scripture. And in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, Paul is giving a testimony as he's getting ready to go to Jerusalem. And at Jerusalem, Jesus is going to allow him to be put on trial and eventually sent to Rome to be a better testimony in front of all of the world. But he's giving his last farewell parting words to these Ephesian believers who've really been strong with him. And he stops and he's talking about his own life, and he says, I haven't taken from anybody anything. I've worked with my hands. And then he gets this one part here, and it's part that even if you haven't gone to church all your life and maybe you don't know a whole lot, but you probably grew up where your parents said something along this line, because this is one of those passages that people who don't even go to church, non-Christians, they sort of quote because it's a good thought too. But it says, he says, remember the words of our Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And I told you last week so many times. I remember as my parents, growing up, my parents would say stuff like that around the holidays, around birthdays, and things like that. And as a young kid, I don't know. Be honest with you, I'm just going to be really honest. I thought my parents were lying to me. Come on, it didn't. How many of you got? I won't do that to you. But honestly, when my parents said that to a little kid, now I'm talking a little kid. Little kids don't think like, yeah, it's better to give. Now, as I've grown up, I realize the truth behind that. But what I think is amazing here is if you go to Jesus' longest recorded sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, that's the chapters there. At the very beginning of that Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives this whole little talk that we call the Beatitudes, which is a fancy word that means the blessednesses, or the things that you'll be blessed in life. And he simply says over and over again all these things, blessed is, blessed is, blessed is. But here Jesus in Acts, he's been recorded, and we don't know exactly when Paul got this from Jesus, but Paul says, hey, remember Jesus' own words, it's not just blessed, but it's more blessed. And we said last week, a bunch of us raised their hand, and maybe you didn't raise your hand, but you were thinking inside, I'd like to be more blessed, because we all want to be more blessed. But we realized last week that being more blessed, in America, we think that means having more. But that's not really what Jesus meant at all. In fact, when you get into that, you've got to realize in this blessing comes some testing, right? In this blessing comes some testing. Are you guys out there today? Okay, I just wanted to make sure you guys are tuned in here. I need some feedback, so relax and all that. Don't fade out on me. With some blessing, there's going to come some testing. Okay, did you get that? With some blessing, there's always going to come some testing. Abraham, you're going to have a child. In fact, no, Abraham, you're going to be the father of a multitude. So many that you won't be able to count them. They're going to be like the stars in the sky. They're going to be like the sand on the seashore. You can't count them. He's 100 years old when he has his first and only child. Whew. And if you asked Abraham, he'd be so happy. In fact, he names his son Isaac, which means laughter, right? Laughter. Because I think he knew that God was playing a joke on him, 100 years old, and you got a little kid. They're both in diapers. We've talked about that before. Here's Abraham, though, and he's trusting God. And so what's God do? Abraham, your son gets old enough to be, a good teenager and all that. So now I want you to take him in. The Bible says that God tested Abraham and told him to offer his son Isaac. And so with the blessing comes some testing. We go through the Bible like that. But that's true. And if it's true for all those people, it's true for you and for me. With blessing comes testing, because it proves what kind of people we really are. It really does. And so when Jesus says, hey, I have this life that I want you to live, it's more blessed, and everybody wants to be more blessed. And last week we looked at that heart of generosity. This week we're going to look at what's the test to it, right? Because there's a test with this heart of generosity, this problem, because he realized there is one huge need here, right? And the question that we have to answer is, will you love and trust money, or will you love and trust God? I mean, come on. And this is like, oh, no, we're going to talk about stuff like this again. Why am I talking about this today? Because the Bible talks about it. But do you realize the biggest topic that Jesus talked about wasn't heaven or hell? It wasn't. Do you know the number one topic that Jesus talked about was finances and material wealth? More than any other subject, he talked more than this. There's over 5,000 verses on this topic alone in the Bible, New Testament. And so Jesus thought this was important. In fact, every time he had a chance to talk to his disciples, he's warning them about it because he knew this is the number one battle. Because the greatest sin in the Bible, the greatest sin in the Bible is idolatry. The greatest sin in the Bible is idolatry, and that means taking God's place and giving it to something else, which in America in the 21st century is money, stuff. And that makes us really uncomfortable because we love our money and stuff. We do. Come on. We love having heat in the winter and air conditioning. And you know, in the old days, they didn't have all that. My dad said one of the greatest things of the modern day of his life was the fact that he didn't have to go out a path to use the restroom anymore. He had indoor plumbing. He was excited about that because he remembers those days when he didn't have those things. And so the question that we're going to answer today is, will you love and trust money, or will you love and trust God? Because God knows that for most of us, money and things will be the number one competitor for our hearts. And that's scary to him. Because money is the number one competitor of hearts, because money counterfeits God. It does. Money counterfeits God, and that's the whole problem. See, money promises only what God can provide. And that's so clear. Just let me give you a couple examples here. Money, we think money in 21st century America, we think money promises security. If I have enough, I'll be safe, right? How much is enough, though? And that's only what God can provide, isn't it? And so we put our trust, we put our hope in our retirement accounts, we put our hope in our job. That's why the first time we get our jobs, our careers, or any financial problems, we start getting shaken, we can't sleep at night, we worry, because we're trusting in our bag with holes in it. Remember we talked about the bag last week? We're not trusting in God. And money promises only what God can provide, and only God can provide security. What else? How about freedom? Money promises freedom, right? Even Dave Ramsey calls it financial freedom. And to an extent, you can get some freedom, but the ultimate freedom of our lives isn't found in money, because money cannot buy you what only God can provide you. Did you get that? Money cannot buy you what only God can provide you. And that's why this is so important, and God realized that. What else? Power, right? Money promises power. If I have enough money, I've got power. I can tell people what to do. That's why we all want to win the lottery. Hey, that's what Dave Ramsey calls it, a fool's tactic. You don't know who this Dave Ramsey guy is. You're missing out, because he's scary. He is. I have listened to Dave Ramsey. I've taught his program in schools and things like that. But I tell you this much. Those people who call into his radio talk show, if you've ever listened to his radio talk show, I'm scared. I would be terrified to call in, because he makes you feel stupid when you don't know what to do with money. He does. So if you don't know who I'm talking about, this guy's crazy. But hey, you know what? We think it's going to give me the freedom of my life to do whatever I want to do. And certainly, as Dave Ramsey would tell us, when you have your money under control, you can live like nobody else does, but only God can really give you freedom. Hey, you know what? Money doesn't give you a peaceful night's sleep. It doesn't. Money doesn't do that for you. Money doesn't give you freedom. What else doesn't money do? Well, money promises only what God can provide, so money sometimes promises significance, right? But notice all the people today that have a lot of money. What are they wanting? More. See, that's the problem. It means it doesn't have enough. These superstar athletes who have to renegotiate their contracts can you imagine that? And I'm going to go on a little self-journey here, but these guys, man, these poor guys only sign for $15 million a year, and that's not fair. They are worth more than that. They ought to get paid more, right? Yeah. That's all I'm going to say on that one. I'm just telling you, and what it should help us understand is this one statement: money promises only what God can provide. And if you think your job, your security, your retirement, your savings, or any of those other things, and I think that's one of the lessons why God's trying to help us see these things and that have happened to us in the last, 10, 12 years with financial collapses and things that are scary to us. I think God's trying to wake up our society and say, hey, stop trying to worship the God of money, because God of money cannot provide what the God Almighty always provides. And that's the truth. So can we trust him? Which takes us to a real strange story. If you have your Bibles today, we're going to be in Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16 tells a story here that is, I'll just be honest with you, it's one of the lesser parables, and if you don't know what a parable is, it's just a fancy term for a story that has a spiritual application to it that Jesus would tell. So this is a story, and it starts off there in Luke chapter 16 and verse number 1, and we're going to read the first 9 verses here, and then I'll make some comments, but notice this. It says here, Jesus told his disciples, and before I get any farther, I do want you to note that. That's so important. Jesus is speaking to a certain group here, and it's not the crowd, it's not the religious people, it's not the unsaved people. So if you're here today or you're watching online live with us today and you've been invited to watch us and you don't know Jesus Christ, your Savior, or you're just like, I'm not sure about this whole Jesus stuff, it's okay. You just sit back and relax. You can sit back and sort of have a smirk on your face and say, you know what, this isn't for me, this is for you, buddy. You can poke the person who invited you here today or whatever because it's theirs. As Christians, we have to own this one because Jesus is telling this story to the disciples, the followers of Christ. That's us. So here we go. Verse number 1, it says, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. Verse 2 goes on to say, so he called him in and asked him, what is this here I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. Verse number 3, it says, the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? That's a little panicky, isn't it? What shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. He goes on to say in verse 4, I know what I'll do. So when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes and into their houses. Verse 5, so he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe the master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. Now, you realize this is a culture that's based on agriculture. They didn't have a lot of liquid cash. It wasn't that system there. So they're trading in commodities here. And he says he owes 900 gallons of olive oil. So this is a major, this is like huge corporation type of deals going on here. 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. So any quick math would tell us that's halving it, right? Half of it gone. Keep going. Verse number 7, it says, then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? And the man replies, 1,000 bushels of wheat. And he replied, he told him, take your bill and make it 800. So he sort of lessened that one. And he goes on, verse 8, he says, the master commended. Now, this is, I think, one of the more surprising things here. Verse 8, the master, not the manager, the master, the rich man. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And make sure you mark that word, circle it in your mind if you have to, if you don't write in your Bible or whatever, you're taking notes. Shrewdly is an important word. For the people of this world are more shrewd. You say that word enough, this sounds weird, doesn't it? More shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. People of the light, hey, that's us, Christ followers. And that's sort of an observation Jesus sort of poked into the story there. And then in verse 9, he finishes it and he says this. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends. Ooh, wow, did you know that was in the Bible? Use worldly wealth to get better vacations, right? Nope. To save up for retirement? Nope. Jesus actually has a plan for what you're supposed to do with your wealth. He says, use worldly wealth to gain friends. Hey, yeah, I'll be your friend. You take me out to dinner, something like that, I'll be your friend, right? Okay, that's biblical. Okay, you can use that one too, by the way. Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now, we stop there, and what we have to realize as we go back, and I want you to think about this short story, but it's sort of weird. Just obviously, and that's why I think so many times, I remember, I was trying to think back if I've ever heard anybody preach on this, and I don't think I've ever heard one sermon ever preached on this one, because it's a weird one, because so many people are like, oh, there's so many things I don't understand. But I think the key to understanding this parable that Jesus is telling is, first of all, understanding who he's speaking to. He's not speaking to the world. He's speaking to his disciples. So this would be the Christian ground. This would be, once again, us. But the very first couple words of this story, if you go back into verse number 1, he says, as he begins to talk about it, he says, there was a rich man whose manager. And if we just stop there, that helps a lot. Now, remember, I've always told you, whenever Jesus tells a story, you always have to look for two things. Who in the story is representing God, and who in the story is representing you and I. So in this story here, there's only two people. There's a rich man, and then there's a manager. And when we talk about this, it should be pretty obvious, but we have to ask this question, do we see ourselves as the owner, the rich man, or do we see ourselves as the manager? Now, the correct answer there should be that you see yourself as the manager, the person who doesn't own it all. And that's key to understanding this. Jesus is teaching a principle that you right away have to get under your mind. You don't own anything. You're just using what he's given you. The rich man is the representation of God in this story. And that's the problem. Now, just the reason it's such a problem for us is we have this mindset that can't be right. Over in Deuteronomy, I told you this last week, Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law, and as Moses is talking to the children of Israel, remember their parents didn't listen to God, and so they wasted 40 years wandering around in circles in a desert and in a wilderness until they all died, and now they're on the precipice of entering into that promised land, the land of Israel, and the land of Canaan, who would be the land of Israel now. And Moses spends a lot of time trying to get them to see, follow God, don't stray off the path. Follow God, don't stray off the path. And these two verses in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 17 and verse 18 are just amazing. Listen to what he says. This is his warning to these people. He says, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. Now, he's telling them when you get into this promised land and God is blessing you and things are going so good in your life, you may sit back and you may pat yourself on the back, just like that farmer last week who had the barn and said, hey, look at me. I'm going to tear down the barn so I can keep it all for myself. That's the warning here. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced. Hey, you know what? We all like to feel good after a good day of work, don't we? Don't we? Come on. Yeah. And you get that paycheck and you feel pretty good about, yeah, I earned this. And you know what he's saying? You didn't earn it at all, because it wasn't yours. You go on to verse 18, and he says, but remember, here's the key. Remember the Lord your God. Don't forget him in the equation, for it is he. It's he that gave you the ability to produce wealth. And so confirms his covenant. Now, he's talking to the children of Israel. He made a covenant with them about the promised land. He says, so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. And he's warning them, whatever you do, don't think that this is your power to do this. And so the first thing we have to understand, and you have to ask yourself in this story, do you think yourself to be the owner? Do you think yourself to be the rich man, or do you think yourself as the manager? And I think when we go through life, remember we talked about that heart of generosity. The problem with our heart of generosity is that so often we think, I'm the provider of my family. I'm the person that takes care of me. I'm the person that does what I need to do. I've got to be strong. And you know what? Hello, that's not biblical. You should work. You should do whatever God allows you to do, but it's always God who provides for you. It's always God. You don't have any ability outside of what God gives you, and thank God he's given you ability to do some things. And we got some pretty talented people in our church. We really do. But God allows you to do things. And so that's the issue today. This parable begins with this foundational truth for us as we integrate our lives. We're not the owner. We're only the manager. We're not the owner. We know the owner. That's the blessing of our life. But we are only the manager or steward. We're not the owner. The stuff you have in life isn't yours. Stop talking about your house and your cars. Stop talking about your job. That's not biblical. God gave you that, and he's the owner, and that's what he's trying to get these disciples to understand. You're sitting back going, what? He's just being mean now. See, Jesus is telling this parable to these disciples, and if we believe that God is this rich owner, this rich man, and that we're the managers, we're the stewards in this story, then that means generosity becomes the standard of life. Because God sets the standard of generosity. we don't own anything, and he gives us stuff to use. See, but the problem is, especially here in 21st century America, if you think you own stuff, if you think yourself to be the owner, you'll constantly struggle, and this is why so many people today struggle. You'll constantly struggle understanding how generosity can bring full joy in your life. Did you get that? When you start thinking that you own stuff, you start struggling with generosity. Yeah. That's why, Donnie, if you paid attention, I don't remember which week it was, but a couple weeks ago, Donnie did an offering talk, and he gave you some pretty earth-shaking statistics. If you were listening carefully, he did a great job. And he said this, and this blew my mind when I heard it, but you realize the average American today who goes to church regularly gives 2.5% of their income to charity of all forms, whether it's church or whatever you want to give to. 2.5%. During the Great Depression, one of the worst time periods in our history of our nation, do you realize it was somewhere close to 5% that people gave during the Great Depression? You mean we make more money today than any time period ever in the history of civilization, and yet we give less? Do you think we struggle with who the owner is? Come on now. Do you think we struggle with who the owner is? We think it's mine, so I'm going to keep it. And you know what? It's not ours. And the first step we have to understand in the story is that we're not the owner. We're not the rich man. We're the manager of the rich man's stuff. Jesus continues the story, and as he tells the story, he lets us in the fact that this owner, this rich man, has brought charges against his manager, which is us, because the manager has been wasting the possessions of the rich man, which shockingly sits back, and that really bothers me, okay? And this is another reason we don't like the story, because what do we say we are? We're the manager, and the charges of being careless with the possessions of the owner is brought against us. And I'm sitting back going, wait a minute, that's not fair. I'm good with God's stuff. And that sort of bristles me up a little bit, but the truth of the matter is God's given us so much stuff, and not just stuff, but so many responsibilities, as in taking the gospel to the whole world, and we haven't been good managers of that. We have been found, and God in this story is charging his disciples with the fact that, hey, you know what, as disciples, and they're going, hey, we don't have anything. We've turned away everything. We're just following you, Jesus. And he says, you haven't been faithful to what I've given you. And that's the responsibility for us all. But he tells them this. He says, you know what? Your days of being the manager, and this is what the rich man in the story says, your days of being the manager are over. I'm bringing you into accountability, but you're done. No more job, no more benefits, no more resources. And what we learn from this, as you're thinking about it, is that our time as being stewards of the resources of our owner, our God, is going to be short. There will be an end to the day of the resources that God gives you. And I think sometimes we live as if everything's okay. Just keep going. It doesn't matter. We won't be the manager, and that's the point. We won't be the manager in our stories forever. Did you get that? We won't be the manager in our stories forever. There's a time when God's going to call us into account. And that's what these disciples are learning here, that there is a day when we have to give account for what we're supposed to be doing here. And so the manager explains, the owner explains to this manager that he's found him guilty. And notice the response of the manager. I think this is telling too. He doesn't argue with it. He doesn't say, hey, wait, let me get my lawyer. He doesn't lawyer up. He doesn't do all these things. He doesn't even give excuses. What does he do? He does what most people who are rational and sound in mind do, right? He understands what's going to happen there. He makes no attempt to explain himself or deny the charges. He does what sane, rational people do. He started talking to himself. Did you read that? It said that. You look there, he says, it says there, he says, then the manager said to himself, verse number 3, the manager said to himself. He was self-talking, and that can be a good thing. Now, before you guys are like snickering, like, I know you guys do this too, right? And you may not admit it, especially men. We're too proud to do that. But you know, when there's nobody in the car with you and you're riding down the road, you turn on the radio station, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just sing. I do this sometimes without even having the radio on. Start singing a song, right? Especially if someone's got you. You remember when Frozen came out? Let it go, let it go. I won't sing that song for you, but you just need a song like that. My wife gets infuriated because I'm one of those people, like, if the wrong song comes up all the time, I'm always humming it, singing it, or whatever, and it just keeps going. And I probably won't even do the whole song. I'll just do one short part of it over and over and over until my wife gets irritated with me and tells me to stop. But I've been known to do, I fell into a burning ring of fire. You know, those kind of songs. Johnny Cash is always good, isn't he? Come on, don't act like you wouldn't do this too. So now, if you're too young, you don't know who Johnny Cash is, sorry. But or, hey, you know what hit me the other day? It was good old Kenny Rogers. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. See, some of you guys are going to start singing now. You can do that. Know when to walk away. Know when, I know. Some of you are holier now, and you're like, I can't believe the preacher's singing secular songs in church. It's okay. It's okay. We're going to have an invitation in a little while, and I'll repent. But you know, that happens sometimes. And you know, it's just, hey, come on. Everybody has to sing Sweet Caroline every once in a while, right? And do the bump, bump, bump. You know, come on, that's the great ones. And so you get some of those songs in your mind, you're singing, maybe you're having a good time, or maybe you're just having that argument with yourself. You know, come on. You know what's really embarrassing is when you're arguing with yourself at a light and somebody looking over it, you're like, crazy in the car. And that happens sometimes too. And hopefully you're not a dancer that's going to town dancing. But anyway, this is biblical because this happened in the Bible. This guy starts talking to himself because things have gotten to that point. And there are points when self-talk actually is a good thing. You know, it's important to think about, though, what you talk about because of this. To live differently, and get this, to live differently, you have to think differently. And to think differently, you have to monitor your thoughts, which is your self-talk. And that's so important that we understand this. And so this man, he's not done a good job at his position, but he's learning something as he's talking to himself. He's saying, oh, we've got a problem. There is no future for me. I don't know where I'm going to live. And he's honest with himself. And that's the greatest thing. When you do self-talk to yourself about important items, whether it's in your head or you're actually verbalizing them, make sure you're being honest with yourself. And that's what's great about this guy, because evidently he had a disposition to be dishonest, but at least he's being honest with himself because he says, hey, right away, hey, you know what? I don't know what I'm going to do because obviously I cannot go out and work manual labor anymore. I'm past those days. He's honest with himself. I can't go out and dig ditches. I can't go out and do the heavy lifting. And on top of that, I can't beg because that would be way beneath me. He realized that. So I've got to figure out, what am I going to do? And he's having that conversation with himself. And you think about how good this is, because in our monitoring of our thoughts, it helps us draw us closer when we are honest with ourselves to the truth which God can direct. How do I know that? Romans chapter 12, verse number 2. Paul said this. He says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed, metamorphosized, right? Be transformed by what? The renewing of your mind. Hey, the mind matters. We need to change the way we think. And when you renew your mind, then you will be able to test and prove what God's will is. So when I self-talk and I'm honest with myself and I'm actually applying God's truth, that's when I'll be able to test, what am I supposed to do in life? How is God's will working? Is it his good will, his pleasing will, his perfect will? Am I in that, or am I doing things wrong and walking away from it? Because that's the whole idea. So the self-talk actually helps this man. This man's upcoming actions resulted in his self-talk, and that's a good thing. He realizes, I'm too weak for manual labor. I'm too proud to beg, and so I need to do something to affect my future. And that's so important. I don't know about you, so often it's easy just to go, hey, you know what? I know the future's coming, but I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. You ever had one of those kind of issues? I don't want to talk about it. Maybe if I don't talk about it, it'll go away. It won't. It won't. Hey, ignoring a problem has never been a solution to a problem. I should have put that down on the screen. Ignoring a problem is never a solution to a problem. Hello? When have you ever been able to ignore something in a health field that was a solution to that. Yeah, I may have cancer, but I think I'm just going to ignore it and hopefully it'll go away. Did it? Right? That's something we have to learn here. We need to be active in our own problems and in the solution for them. This is what this guy understands. Hey, I've got to start thinking about what's going on. So in response to this imminent crisis that this man has, what does he do? He calls in the debtors of the rich man. Now, evidently, I've already noted that this rich man was running something bigger than just a small little, mom and pop clinic. This was a lot of money here. This was a lot of items that he's having to reclaim. And so this manager, using his shrewd ability, and I told you we'd come back to this word, but he calls in debtors, and they just tell you about two, but it gives you the idea that he called in several of them. They're not going to give you an unlimited list. And he tells the first guy, he says, hey, take out your bill, and you have to understand, in Jesus' time, this is the way it worked, okay? There wasn't paper money like we'd see or checks or anything like that. What they would do is basically an IOU. But here's how it worked in order for everything to be considered legitimate. The manager, who we find in this story to be us, the manager would have the paper, and he would take that to the person who was borrowing or owed the debt, and they would write their own IOU out on that paper and sign it. And then they would give it back to the manager, and the manager would hold on to those papers. So what you find here in the story is very true to their time period. This manager brings out the papers, and he hands them to these people who owe the master, this rich man, and he says, hey, here you go. Now, what I want you to do is you owe, right? You owe this, and it's in their handwriting. They say, yes. Okay, take half of it off. Draw a line through it. Cut that down. Now, he didn't go crazy and do away the whole debt, because that would be silly. No one would believe that to be true. But he discounted it way down. Now, why did he do that? Because he understood when he did that, when he discounted these guys, they didn't know what was going on with him and the owner, did they? No. He was actually making it look like the owner, this rich man, was a very generous man. He was making the rich man look good in the eyes of the debtors. And so he was also working for himself in that he was causing them to think that he was working on their behalf too. And so he's gotten in good with both sides. And his rich man, though he's losing out on some money, he was already losing out on money because the manager was poorly using it, but now he's done something that causes a reaction from the rich man. That's the whole craziness. See, what we have in this strange story here is this dishonest manager is actually commended, and that's why I think it's so strange. So we get down to it, and in comes after all this has happened, all these discounts are given, all the money's changed, the rich man comes in to look over the accounts, to settle out with his manager who's poorly wasted his resources. And notice, and this is where a lot of people have a problem with this, notice what he does. He commends this poor manager, this dishonest manager. But what you have to notice is what he commends them for. He does not, and make sure you're clear on this, the rich man, who is God, does not commend him in his dishonesty. He commends him for being shrewd. Now, that's a word that really just stands out. It's this word we don't use very often. I think we all know what it means, but you realize it was used multiple times in the Bible. And here's what's really interesting on this word. The word shrewd, the Greek word here, is actually the same word that they used in Hebrew back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse number 1, when it says, now the serpent was more subtle. Same word. More subtle than any other creature in the garden. It's also the same term that Jesus used when he sent out his disciples in twos, and he said, hey, I want you to go out, and I want you to be as wise or shrewd as serpents and harmless as doves. And that's a strange system there, because both of those situations give us the whole connotation of that snake in the Garden of Eden, and we all know who the snake was, right? He wasn't good, but what is he really saying there? He's saying, I'm commending you not for being dishonest, but for thinking about what is imminent, the future coming down. You're so shrewd, you are actually forward thinking. What do you think Satan was doing in the Garden of Eden when he snakes his way in to see Eve? You know what he was thinking about? The future, wasn't he? Wasn't he? Because he didn't know everything, but he knew what he needed to do. And he was thinking, I'm going to take down God's future, Adam and Eve. And so he subtly came into the presence there. And he was forward thinking there. And you know what God was telling his disciples? Jesus was telling his disciples as he sent them out to do the work. You know what he's saying? When he told them to be as wise as serpents, or subtle or shrewd as serpents, you know what he's telling us to do? Hey, let's be forward thinking. Let's think of the future. You know, have you noticed churches these days aren't very full? You know why? Because churches haven't been very forward thinking, have they? In fact, most of the churches I know, you know what they do? They sit around and talk about the past. Remember the good old days? And you know what? Satan's smiling because he doesn't want you to think about the future. God does. And this dishonest servant here who's wasted the resources, you know what he's commended for? Not being dishonest. He's commended because he was thinking about his future, being shrewd, setting up a plan for what's going to happen when there is no future. And that's the point of this whole passage as we get down to it. See, what he wants us to understand here, he wants us to understand that this man, he's praising this manager for his foresight to anticipate what he would need after he was dismissed from his current situation, and how that he was making the most of his future needs, for his future needs. Think about this. Go down to, we'll keep down in our story in Luke 16, verse 11, and pick back up. In verse number 11, it says, Jesus speaking then, and he's giving you the summation of what's happening. He's helping the disciples understand what he's trying to get to. And he says, so, that's always drawing a conclusion. That's one of those words. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you haven't seen this verse, man, sometimes I think we miss the words. But notice what he just said. If you haven't been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, and notice what he's going to contrast with. Who will trust you with, what's those last two words? True riches. What did Jesus just say there? That true riches aren't the money in your pocket. Did you get that? True, hey, I think the best picture you get is when Jesus, when John is told about the heaven, the New Jerusalem, and he says, hey, you know what the streets are made out of? Pure gold. Pure gold. Now, that sounds like, wow, that's so cool. No, what he's saying is, gold is so common in heaven, it's not even worth much, so they use it for pavement. Do you get that? And that's what God is trying to get us to understand here. Don't make money, don't make gold your God, because it's not even true riches. Did you hear that? Verse 11. Jesus says, if you've not been trustworthy with the things I gave you here on this earth, the money in your pocket. Now, who in the 12 disciples wasn't trustworthy? Verse 12, he goes on. And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? John 14, right? What did John 14 say? Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. That's Jesus speaking. In my Father's house are many mansions, right? And what has he done? He's gone to prepare those for us so that one day we'll have them. So what he's saying here is, hey, if you can't be trustworthy with the things that God's given you right here in Seagrove, Asheboro, North Carolina, why would God go out of his way to give you something good in the afterlife? You can spend all your life, that short breath that you're going to have, and waste your time building the biggest home, the biggest business, the biggest bank account, But in the end, if you haven't managed well, been trustworthy with, been generous with God's resources, what do you think heaven's going to be like for you? Verse 13. No one, and this is that verse we've heard so many times, no one. Now, why would he say no one? Because we all think we're the exception to the rule, right? Even today, there are some people sitting here listening saying, this is good for somebody else, but I've got this under control. He's talking to his disciples. He's talking to Peter, to James, to John, the people that we would consider some of the greatest Christians ever. And he's saying, hey, disciples, no one, not even you, not even Peter, not even James, not even John, my best friend, no one can serve two masters. And what two masters would they be? What do we start out with a question? Will you love and trust God, or will you love and trust money? There's their two. He says either, go back, he says either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one. Notice the word, devoted. Devoted, endeared to. That word devoted is a term of relationship here. Like two young lovebirds, like Hannah and Grayson, right? Sorry guys, I brought you up. They make those googly eyes at each other, and you're like, oh yeah, that's cool. And that's what he's saying. He says, when you start making those eyes at the money you bring home, the overtime hours you have to work because you want more, he says, it's over between you and God. Because you're going to despise the other. Despise. Sarah despised Hagar when Hagar had Ishmael. Same word. That's the truth there. And then he makes that statement that we've all heard before. You cannot serve both God and money. The old word was mammon, which means more than just money. It means possessions, wealth. And that's where we're at. He gets this. And Jesus' parable is saying that we need to plan for the future. We need to plan for eternity. And he's not talking about your salvation today, is he now? He's talking about laying up treasure for yourself in heaven, because that's where true generosity gets to. See, Jesus' parable is saying that we are the manager, but not forever. Our time is short. And decisive action now will keep, with what we cannot keep, will in some way make a difference in our futures. And really what he's saying here is the road to who we are becoming in the future begins right now. Right now with the things you have. Right now with how you use what you have. This discerning manager, this shrewd manager, he saw this. He saw the future as the issue. And he acted in a way that his boss who's firing him understood that he was doing well and commended him for it. So how are you doing? Do you believe the future is important? And I'm not talking about the future 5 years from now. I'm talking about the future after this life is over. How important is it? See, a discerning manager has an urgency to act now, not later. But here's the problem, and this is always the problem. The reason we don't get this, the reason Jesus talked about this subject more than ever, is there's always a reason to delay our generosity. Oh, preacher, you don't understand. I don't have a lot of money. When we get more, we'll give more. That's what we say, but it never happens, right? What did I tell you already? We make more money now in this time period than any people on the planet have ever made. Right? And notice how we complain more about it too. It's not enough, it's not enough. But the truth of the matter is, we make more than anybody ever, and yet we give less. We're less generous than any other generation has ever been. Ooh, wow. That's important. We always say things, well, things will be different when we have more, right? We'll be different when we decide that God's going to change us. That's when we'll actually be different. And that's the truth today. Luke 16:10, remember this verse? This is the verse I skipped. If I went from verse 9 to verse 11, but this is what Jesus said. Whoever can be trusted with very little. Most of us in this room say, I don't have much. And that was the point, right? Because that's what his disciples were saying as they didn't have much, right? They'd given up their jobs. They'd given up everything to walk with Jesus. And he says, whoever can be trusted with very little, can God trust you with hardly anything? Whoever can be trusted with very little can be trusted with very much. And whoever is dishonest with very little, will also be dishonest with very much. That's the tough statement there. That's the heart of everything. Can God trust you? Because with every blessing comes a testing, right? That was the problem. See, here's the point of today. If you don't get anything else, here it is. Generosity is never about how much we have. Did you get that? It's never about how much we have. It's about how much of our hearts God has. That's the problem. That's where it's at.